The trouble began, as the very best trouble always does, with the soup. They had got through the introductions, and the seating, and the first careful glances down the long candlelit table at Avondale Court, and the Duke of Avondale was just beginning to believe that the most reckless lie of his life might actually survive the evening, when his grandmother, the Dowager Duchess, set down her spoon with a small, precise click that silenced the entire table, fixed the young woman seated at her grandson's right hand with a pair of eyes that had reduced bishops to stammering, and said, in a voice like a velvet glove pulled over an iron fist, "Tell me, my dear, since you are to marry into this family, you will of course know the date of my late husband's birthday, which my grandson holds so sacred. Benedict will have told his beloved that much, surely." And every soul at that table turned to look at the woman, who was supposed to be the Duke's devoted fiancée of 6 months' standing, and who had, in point of fact, met the Duke for the very first time at 4 o'clock that same afternoon, and did not know his grandfather's name, let alone his birthday, and was being paid by the hour to pretend otherwise. And the woman, whose name was Verity Finch, which is a wonderful joke all by itself, since verity means truth. And Verity Finch had not told the whole truth about anything in 9 professional years, did not so much as blink. She set down her own spoon with a click that precisely matched the dowager's. She met the terrifying old eyes with a warmth so convincing it would have melted a magistrate, and she said, "The 14th of October, Your Grace. Though Benedict tells me you yourself never celebrate it on the day, but always 3 days after, because the late Duke proposed to you 3 days after his own birthday, and you have always insisted the proposal was the better anniversary of the two." There was a small silence. It was, in fact, a complete fabrication. Verity Finch had invented every word of it in the half-second before she spoke, out of nothing but instinct and nerve. And the Dowager Duchess of Avondale looked at her for a long, long moment, and then she smiled, a slow, dangerous, delighted smile. The smile of a master swordsman who has just discovered that the stranger at the other end of the duel actually knows how to fence. And the Duke of Avondale, watching the 2 most formidable women he had ever encountered take each other's measure across his grandmother's soup, felt his heart do something it had not done in years, and thought, with genuine alarm, "Oh no, oh no, this was supposed to be one dinner. What is happening here? A duke, a dragon, and a woman being paid by the hour to lie to both of them over the fish course. Yes, I can see you have questions, and I promise you we are going to answer every one. But not yet. A story this delicious has to be unwrapped slowly, like a present you already know you are going to love. So let me do the thing I always do and pause and ask, where in the world are you tonight? Tell me, down in the comments. Because I am sitting here in the dark with this absurd and wonderful tale, and I do so love to picture all of you on the other side of it. If you are new to my fire, I am Jane, and I tell the old, slow kind of stories, the kind that take their time. So press subscribe and settle in and let me earn the next hour and a half. And here is my warning, the same as always. If you reach the end of this and still have not subscribed, then you and I are going to have words, because by then you will owe me a favor, and you know perfectly well that I always collect. Now, come back with me to that very afternoon, 4 o'clock, some hours before the soup, when a desperate duke knocked on a very particular door in a very unfashionable street, looking for a professional liar, and found the only one in London worth her fee. Let me introduce you properly to Verity Finch, because she is the cleverest heroine I have had the pleasure of bringing you in some time, and she earned every inch of her cleverness the hard way. She was, in the plainest terms, a woman who had turned other people's social catastrophes into a livelihood. It was not a trade you would find listed anywhere. There was no shingle over her door. But in the quiet, desperate corners of polite society, among the people who had a problem they could not solve and could not speak of aloud, the word passed, discreetly, hand to hand. If you are in a fix that requires someone to be someone they are not, convincingly, respectably, and with absolute discretion, there is a Mrs. Finch. What did Mrs. Finch do? Why, whatever was required. She had played a respectable widowed cousin for a young man whose family doubted he had any respectable relations at all. She had played a chaperone for a girl whose real chaperone had run off with a dancing master, holding the whole fiction together long enough to save the girl's match. She had played a grieving mourner at the funeral of a lonely old man who had no one, paid in advance by the old man himself, who could not bear the thought of an empty churchyard, and had hired, with his last guineas, someone to weep for him properly. She had played companions and confidantes, and once, memorably, a Russian countess. And she had never, not once in 9 years, been caught, because Verity Finch was simply the finest natural actress that the London stage had ever failed to discover. She had trodden the boards for a few seasons in her youth, before she understood that the real money and the real safety lay not in playing to a thousand strangers in the dark, but in playing to one desperate client in the light. A private performance with a private fee, and the fee was the heart of it. Verity Finch charged, and she charged well, and she kept her accounts with the meticulous ferocity of a woman who has been poor enough to know that sentiment is a luxury and a balanced ledger is survival. Because here is the thing under the wit, and you must have it now, or you will misjudge her, and I will not allow you to misjudge her. Verity Finch was not mercenary out of greed. She was mercenary out of love, which is a thing the world is very bad at telling apart. She had a younger brother named Tom, 12 years old, the only family she had left in the world, and Tom was at a good school, a very good school, the kind that turns a clever boy into a man with prospects. And the fees for that school were paid every term on the dot by his devoted elder sister, who had told the headmaster that she was the widow of a respectable naval officer, and who would have told him she was the Queen of Sheba if it had kept Tom in his place at that desk. Everything Verity did, every role she played, every outrageous fee she charged and itemized and collected, was so that Tom Finch would never, ever have to do what she had done, never have to fall, as the two of them had fallen, when their father died and left them with a good name and not a penny to keep it on, and a world that had no use whatsoever for a gently bred girl with no money and no protector. Verity had been seen 17, and she had learned, fast and hard, that the world would let a woman like her starve with her gentility intact, or survive by her wits without it, and she had chosen, with a kind of cold fury that never entirely left her, to survive. I want you to have that fall properly, because it is the wound under all the wit. The Finches had been a respectable family, not grand, but good, a clergyman's family with a clergyman's modest comfort and a clergyman's fatal assumption that respectability was itself a kind of money. And then the Reverend Mr. Finch died, suddenly, of a winter fever, and left a 17-year-old daughter and a 5-year-old son and a stack of small debts, and not one penny of provision, because he had always meant to provide later, the way kind improvident men always mean to. And 17-year-old Verity discovered, in the space of a single dreadful season, exactly how the world treats a gently bred girl with no money, no father, and a child to keep. The relations who had dined at the rectory were suddenly very busy. The respectable doors closed one after another, gently, with murmured regrets. The only doors that opened were the ones a respectable girl was not supposed to walk through, and Verity Finch stood on the cold step of her closed-up life with a hungry 5-year-old's hand in hers, and she did the arithmetic the world had set her, and she walked through the open door. She went on the stage, because it was that or worse, and she had a gift for it, and she found something else too, that the safety was not in the applause but in the performance itself, in the discovery that she could become anyone, and that a woman who can become anyone need never again be caught being only herself, helpless on a cold step. So she turned the gift into a trade, and the trade into an armour, and she raised her brother on the proceeds of 9 years of being everyone except Verity Finch, and she told herself, every single day, that it was a price worth paying, and most days she even believed it. She had made herself untouchable the only way such a woman could, by feeling nothing, owing nothing, needing no one, and charging for everything. It is a very good armour. It had one flaw, which she did not know about yet, and which a duke and a dragon were about to find between them in the space of a single week. She had a rule. It was the first rule, the rule on which the whole enterprise stood, and she had never broken it in 9 years. The rule was, it is never real. Whatever you play, whatever you feel, whatever they feel, it is a performance. It has a beginning and a fee and an end. And the moment you let any part of it become real, you are finished. Because a woman who feels things cannot keep the books straight, and a woman who cannot keep the books straight ends up exactly where Verity Finch had begun, at 17, with a good name and no money and nowhere to go. It is never real. Remember that, because the whole story is the breaking of it. Now, the Duke of Avondale, Benedict, to the very few people permitted to call him anything, was, at the start of this, a man with a reputation for being clever, cold, and entirely unmarriageable, and only one of those three things was true. He was clever. He had one of the sharp tongues in the House of Lords, and a way of demolishing a foolish argument that left grown men checking themselves for visible wounds. The cold was mostly armour, the kind that clever, lonely people grow when they have learned that being clever is admired, and being known is not. And the unmarriageable was a slander he had cultivated on purpose, because the Duke of Avondale had watched his parents' great society marriage curdle into 40 years of glittering, public, well-bred misery, and he had decided, young, that he would rather be alone than be that, and had spent his entire adulthood fending off the matchmaking armies of England with a wit sharp enough to draw blood. He was, in short, a man absolutely determined never to marry, which is, as you and I both know, the precise condition fate most enjoys correcting. And fate's instrument, in his case, was his grandmother. I must give you the Dowager Duchess of Avondale properly, because she is the engine of this whole machine, and one of my favourite creatures I have ever set loose in a story. Honoria, Dowager Duchess of Avondale, was 81 years old, 4 feet 11 inches tall, and the single most frightening human being in 3 counties. She had buried a duke, 2 prime ministers' ambitions, and any number of presumptuous young women who had imagined themselves a match for her grandson. She saw everything. She forgot nothing. She had a way of asking a perfectly innocent question that landed like a dropped anchor, and a way of saying how interesting that made strong men confess to things they had not done. And she had decided, in the winter of her grandson's 34th year, that the nonsense had gone on quite long enough, that the dukedom required an heir, and that since Benedict had so signally failed to produce a bride through his own efforts, she would simply produce one for him. She had selected the candidate herself, a Lady Eustacia Pomfret, impeccably bred, impeccably dull, with a mother, Lady Pomfret, of such relentless ambition that she could have laid siege to a fortress with a teacup and a calling card. And the Dowager had summoned her grandson to Avondale Court for a small family dinner at which he would meet Lady Eustacia, and at which the Dowager had made unmistakably clear in a letter that Benedict had read 3 times, with mounting horror, and understanding would be reached. The Duke of Avondale did the thing that desperate, clever men do when cornered by a force greater than themselves. He panicked, and he lied. He wrote back to his grandmother, and he would spend a good deal of the following week regretting the impulse that she need not trouble herself about Lady Eustacia, as he was in fact already engaged. Secretly engaged, these 6 months passed, to a young woman of excellent family, whom he had been keeping quiet, only out of respect for a recent bereavement in her family, and whom he would be delighted to bring to dinner so that his grandmother might meet her future granddaughter at last. He had, of course, no such fiancée. He had written the letter in a fit of cornered defiance and posted it before he could think better of it, and he had received, by return of the fastest post in the kingdom, a reply from his grandmother expressing her boundless delight, and her keen anticipation of meeting the dear girl at dinner on Thursday. It was Tuesday. The Duke of Avondale had panicked himself into needing to produce in 48 hours a fiancé of excellent family who could survive an evening of his grandmother's interrogation, or be marched, exposed as a liar in front of the most terrifying woman in England, straight into the arms of Lady Eustacia Pomfret. And it was in this condition, elegant, ducal, and entirely undone, that he made certain discreet inquiries among the only sort of people who know how to solve unsolvable social problems, and was given, in a low voice, an address in an unfashionable street, and the name of a Mrs. Finch. Oh, I wish I could have been at that first meeting, and since I am telling the story, I shall pretend that I was. Picture the Duke of Avondale, who had never in his life climbed a narrow stair to ask anyone for anything, climbing a narrow stair to ask for help. Picture Verity Finch receiving him in her small, scrupulously clean front room, having sized up his coat, his boots, his desperation, and his probable income before he had finished removing his hat. And picture the negotiation, which was, I am told, a thing of beauty. The Duke explained his predicament with the pained delicacy of a proud man confessing a folly. Verity Finch listened with the serene attention of a physician hearing symptoms she has heard 100 times. And when he had finished, she did not gasp or blush or exclaim at the impropriety or do any of the things he had braced himself for. She picked up a pen, drew a fresh sheet of paper toward her, and said, "Let us be clear about the engagement. One dinner. I arrive as your fiancé of 6 months. I am of good family, recently bereaved to explain the secrecy, and I survive an evening with your grandmother. Have I understood the commission?" The Duke said that she had, and Verity Finch began calmly to write him an estimate. He had not expected the estimate. I do not think it had occurred to the Duke of Avondale, in his entire ducal life, that anyone would present him with an itemized accounting of anything. Bills were things that happened, somewhere, to other people, and were paid by men he never met. But Verity Finch slid the sheet across the table, and he picked it up, and he read, in a neat, merciless hand, "Engagement of professional services, one evening. Item, portrayal of fiancé, standard rate. Item, full personal history to be invented, memorized, and maintained, research and preparation surcharge. Item, hazard pay, for performance before the Dowager Duchess of Avondale, whose reputation is known to me." And at the bottom, a total that made the Duke of Avondale, one of the richest men in England, actually blink. He looked up at her. "This," he said, "is robbery." And Verity Finch looked back at him, perfectly pleasant, and said, "No, Your Grace. Robbery is what happens to you on Thursday if you send a frightened amateur to lie to your grandmother. This is insurance. You will find it cheap at the price." And then, before he could recover, she laid out her conditions, because Verity Finch never took a commission without them, and they tell you everything about how she had survived. 3 rules, Your Grace, and they are not negotiable, so do not waste your breath or my time attempting it. First, you will tell me the truth, completely, about everything I might be asked, however unflattering. I cannot defend a position I do not know the shape of, and clients who hide things from me are clients who get us both caught. Second, you will follow my lead in the room without hesitation. If I say we became engaged in Bath, we became engaged in Bath, and you will not look startled, you will look like a man fondly remembering Bath. The performance fails the instant the two performers disagree, and I do not fail performances. And third, and here she paused and looked at him with something that was almost a warning. You will remember, at every moment, that it is not real. Whatever I appear to feel, whatever you may find yourself feeling in the warmth of a convincing performance, it is a service rendered for a fee, and it ends when the fee is paid. I have found that gentlemen sometimes forget this. It is the only part of the work that has ever caused me difficulty, and I will not have it. Are we agreed? And the Duke of Avondale, amused and faintly, stung and entirely unaware that he was being solemnly warned against the precise thing that was about to happen to them both, said that they were agreed. And the Duke of Avondale, who had spent his whole life being the cleverest person in every room, felt the unfamiliar and not entirely unpleasant sensation of having met someone who might be cleverer, and paid the estimate, and thereby, though neither of them knew it, set fire to both their carefully guarded lives. The drive to Avondale Court was meant to be the briefing, and it was here, in the carriage, that the two of them first truly took each other's measure, and I want to give it to you, because it is where the spark caught. Verity, all business, produced a small notebook and interrogated him. His grandfather's name, his estates, the family history, the precise nature of their invented courtship, the bereavement she was to have suffered, absorbing it all with frightening speed, building a person out of facts, the way a sculptor builds a figure out of clay. And the Duke, answering, found himself watching her work with a fascination he had not felt in years. Because she was good, she was so good. He could actually see the fictional fiancée assembling herself, in real time, behind her quick grey eyes. At one point he tested her, sprang a question she had not been briefed on, to see how she would handle a gap. And without missing a beat, she invented a charming, specific, plausible answer, and then looked at him with a small, dry smile and said, "Was that a test, Your Grace? You may stop testing me. I have never failed a performance, and I do not intend to begin with the one that costs the most." And the Duke of Avondale laughed, a real laugh, surprised out of him, and said, "You know, I begin to think this may be the best money I have ever spent." He considered her a moment, this composed, quick, faintly amused woman dismantling and reassembling a human identity in a moving carriage, and added, with the air of a man poking at something, to see if it bites, "Tell me, Mrs. Finch, does anything frighten you? You are about to lie to the most frightening woman in England, and you appear less anxious than I am about my own cravat." And Verity Finch, without looking up from her notebook, said, "A great many things frighten me, Your Grace. Hunger frightens me. My brother's school fees coming due frighten me. A winter without enough coal frightens me. Your grandmother does not frighten me, because your grandmother is a problem, and problems I know how to solve. It is only the things you cannot invoice for that are truly frightening, and your grandmother, whatever else she is, has a price." She turned a page. "Everything has a price. That is the most comforting fact I know." The Duke watched her for a moment longer, and something in him, some armoured, lonely, watchful thing, recognized something in her, some armoured, lonely, watchful thing of exactly the same make, and he did not say so, because he had no words yet for the unsettling sensation of meeting one's own species for the first time. And Verity Finch, looking out the carriage window, so he would not see that his laugh had pleased her, said, "Most clients say that on the way in, Your Grace. It is on the way out that they discover the overtime. Hold that line. It is funnier than it knows, and it is also, in a way neither of them suspected, a prophecy. Now we come to the dinner where we began, and to the soup, and to the moment Verity Finch invented an entire anniversary out of thin air, and the Dowager Duchess smiled her dangerous, delighted smile. And I must tell you the secret of that smile, because it is the first great turn of this story, and it is the funniest and most dangerous thing in it. The Dowager Duchess of Avondale was not fooled. She had not been fooled for a single instant. She had known, from roughly the moment Verity Finch walked into her drawing room with too perfect composure, that the girl was not what she claimed. She had been managing the great houses and great deceptions of England for 60 years, and she could smell a performance the way a hound smells a fox. She had asked the question about her husband's birthday, not to expose a fraud she suspected, but to confirm one she was already certain of. And what she had discovered, in the dazzling speed and nerve of Verity's invented answer, was not a fraud to be punished, but a talent to be acquired. Because here is what the Dowager Duchess saw that night, and what no one else at the table saw, and what changed everything. She saw her grandson, her clever, cold, lonely, determinedly unmarriageable grandson, whom she loved more than she loved her own life, and despaired of more than anything on earth. She saw him laugh at something the false fiancé said, really laugh. She had not heard Benedict laugh like that in 20 years, not since he was a boy, before the world taught him to armour himself in wit. She watched the two of them spark off one another all through dinner, parry and riposte. Two clever people, delighting in finally finding another clever person to play against. And she watched her grandson come alive in a way that the entire eligible peerage of England had never once managed to provoke. For the banter that dinner was a thing to behold, and the dowager beheld it. When a pompous cousin held forth on the impossibility of a true marriage between unequal minds, Verity said, mild as milk, "I quite agree, which is why I have always thought the safest marriages are between two people of no mind, at all, who can never disappoint one another." And the Duke had to disguise his laugh as a cough. When the Duke teased her, testing the performance, "My dear, you have not told them how I proposed." Verity turned to the table and said, without an instant's hesitation, "He did it very badly, which is how I knew he meant it. A man who proposes smoothly has practiced, and a man who has practiced has proposed before. Benedict was so dreadful at it that I was entirely satisfied of his sincerity." And the table roared, and the Duke looked at her with an admiration he forgot to pretend. And the Dowager saw it, and the Dowager filed it away. They built on each other's jokes. They finished each other's thrusts. They had, in the space of one dinner, the easy lethal rhythm of two duelists who have found at last an opponent worthy of the blade. And there is nothing in this world that looks more exactly like love than two clever lonely people discovering that they have finally met their match. The Dowager had been married 50 years to a man she adored and fenced with every day of it, and she knew the look of it in her bones. And so the Dowager Duchess of Avondale, who had summoned this dinner to install the dull and suitable Lady Eustacia, looked at the brilliant, fraudulent, utterly unsuitable Mrs. Finch, making her grandson glow like a banked fire stirred to life, and she made a decision on the spot, with the ruthless speed that had made her a legend. She did not want the suitable girl. She wanted this one. And she would have her, by whatever means necessary, and she would let neither of the two fools at her table know that she was now running the entire campaign herself. From the inside, 3 moves ahead of both of them. So the Dowager did the most alarming thing she could possibly have done, from the Duke's point of view. She approved. enthusiastically, overwhelmingly. Before the dinner was over, she had declared herself charmed, declared the engagement the most delightful news she had received in a decade, and declared, to the Duke's dawning horror, that one dinner was nowhere near enough, that the dear girl must of course stay, that she would not hear of Mrs. Finch returning to town when there was so much for a future Duchess of Avondale to learn about her new family, and that she was, that very evening, inviting a small house party of the family's nearest connections to assemble at Avondale Court over the coming week so that everyone might meet darling Benedict's bride. The trap, you see, had reversed itself with a click as precise as the dowager's spoon. The Duke had hired a woman to play his fiancée for one dinner. His grandmother had just extended the engagement, against his will and entirely beyond his control, to a week-long house party in front of the whole family, and there was not one single thing could do about it, without confessing the fraud to the very woman he had invented it to deceive. You can imagine the scene in the corridor afterward, the two of them hissing at each other in the dark like a pair of conspirators whose plot has gone gloriously wrong. The Duke, appalled. A week, Mrs. Finch, in front of my entire family. This was one dinner. And Verity Finch, who had recovered her composure faster than he had, and was already, behind her grey eyes, recalculating. Verity Finch said the line that would become, over that long week, the running heartbeat of the whole affair. She said, "Then I shall require a revised estimate, Your Grace." One dinner was the agreed scope. A week-long engagement in front of your family is a substantially larger commission, and there will, I am afraid, be overtime. And she said it with such cool professional gravity, standing in a darkened ducal corridor, having just bewitched the most terrifying woman, England, that the Duke of Avondale, against every instinct of self-preservation he possessed, started to laugh again, and had to clap his own hand over his mouth, in the dark like a schoolboy, so that the dragon would not hear. The week that followed was, I am happy to report, an escalating catastrophe of the most delightful kind, and I shall give you the best of it. The house filled with relations, aunts and cousins and connections, and the dreadful Lady Pomfret with her dull daughter Eustacia, who had arrived expecting to become a duchess, and had instead arrived to find the position apparently filled, and who spent the entire week in a state of barely contained fury that was, I will not lie to you, one of the chief pleasures of everyone else's visit. And through it all, Verity Finch gave the performance of her life, was charming, was clever, was exactly the well-bred, slightly bereaved, devoted young woman she had invented in a carriage, never slipping, never faltering, holding an enormous and growing lie aloft through dinner after dinner and morning after morning by sheer professional brilliance. She kept a notebook. Every evening, in her room, by candlelight, she updated her accounts and her invented history and her running invoice. And the invoice grew, line by glorious line. Item, additional days, at the extended engagement rate. Item, the management of Lady Pomfret, hazard surcharge. Item, memorization of the names, ages, and grievances of 19 members of the Avondale family. Item, one near discovery successfully averted. She showed me that invoice once, in my imagination, and it is a masterpiece, and it grew longer every single day, because Verity Finch was a professional, and a professional keeps the books. Let me give you 3 scenes from that week, because they are too good to leave in summary, and because each one tightened the screw a little further. The first was the matter of Sir Rowland Featherstone, a florid, hearty, half-deaf old gentleman, a cousin of the family, who arrived on the second day, took one look at Verity across the drawing-room, and said, in the carrying voice of the comfortably deaf, I say, I know that face. Where the devil have I seen that face? Now, Sir Rowland was a famous patron of the theatre, the kind of old gallant who had spent 40 years in the better boxes ogling the better actresses. And Verity Finch had, in her brief stage career 9 years before, been precisely the kind of actress that the better boxes ogled. The whole room went still. The Duke went pale. And Verity, who had felt the trap close around her 100 times, and learned that the only escape is forward, walked straight up to Sir Rowland, gave him her warmest smile, and said, loudly enough for his poor ears, "You are thinking of my late mother, Sir Rowland. Everyone says I am her very image. She was much admired in her youth. I am so glad her memory is still carried by gentlemen of taste." And Sir Rowland, delighted to be called a gentleman of taste, and entirely unable to contradict a story about a woman he could not quite remember, beamed and bowed and said yes, yes, of course. The very image, a great beauty, he remembered her well, remembering, in fact, an actress he had once admired, and being gently steered into believing she had been Verity's respectable mother. The Duke watched the whole manoeuvre from across the room with his heart in his mouth, and afterward, when they had a moment alone, he said, a little shaken, "He nearly had you." And Verity said, calmly straightening her gloves, "Your Grace, I am never nearer to being had than at the moment I appear most at ease. That is the entire trick of it. The amateur panics and runs. The professional walks toward the thing and shakes its hand." And she made a note in her book that evening. Item: one near discovery averted. Surcharge applied. She was, even frightened, keeping the accounts. The second scene belongs to Lady Pomfret, and it is the comedy of the piece, because Lady Pomfret had not survived 3 decades of social warfare without learning to recognize an enemy, and she had recognized Verity Finch as an enemy the instant her own daughter's dukedom walked out the door on another woman's arm. Lady Pomfret did not believe in the engagement. She could not have said why. Verity's performance was flawless, but the instinct of a thwarted, social predator is a powerful thing, and Lady Pomfret set herself, over that week, to the single-minded project of exposing the interloper and restoring the Duke to her dreary Eustacia. She laid traps of her own. She asked Verity sudden questions about people the real fiancé would surely know. She arranged to be present when Verity did not expect company, hoping to catch the mask slipping. She even, on the 4th day, attempted to bribe Verity's lady's maid Suki, a sharp, loyal, theatrically trained creature who had been with Verity for years, and who took Lady Pomfret's coin with every appearance of treachery, then reported the entire conversation to her mistress that night, in fits of laughter, having fed Lady Pomfret a magnificent quantity of convincing nonsense in exchange. Her ladyship believes, Suki reported, deadpan, brushing out Verity's hair, that you are the secret daughter of an Venetian banker, and that your engagement is a plot to seize the Avondale silver. I did not discourage her. It seemed unkind to spoil such a good story when she was enjoying it so. Verity laughed until she had to hold her sides, and added a line to the invoice. Item: the management of Lady Pomfret, hazard surcharge, doubled. And the joke of it, the real joke, was that Lady Pomfret was the only person in the entire house, besides the Dowager, who had correctly guessed that the engagement was a fraud. And she was so disliked and so obviously motivated by spite that not one soul would have believed her if she had stood on the dinner table and shouted it. The truth in that house was safest in the mouth of the one person no one would credit. There is a lesson in that, somewhere, about how the world decides what to believe, and it is not a flattering one. The third scene is the Dowager's, and it is the one that did the real damage, because, while everyone else was either fooled or fooling, the old woman was quietly, deliberately, with the patience of a master gardener, arranging the conditions in which something real might grow. She did it by the simple expedient of throwing the two of them together at every possible opportunity, and then withdrawing. She would announce that dear Benedict must show his betrothed the long gallery, the rose garden, the view from the East Tower, and then discover, at the last moment, that her old bones could not manage the stairs and send the young people off alone. She seated them together at every meal, and then engaged the rest of the table so pointedly that the two of them were left, in effect, alone in a crowd, with nothing to do but talk to each other. She was manufacturing intimacy the way a chemist manufactures a reaction, putting the two elements in a sealed room and standing back. And it worked, because the elements were, whatever they told themselves, extremely combustible. Verity knew exactly what the old woman was doing. She was far too clever not to, and she found, to her alarm, that knowing did not help in the slightest, because the conversations the Dowager engineered were not performances. They had stopped being performances somewhere around the third day, and Verity could not have said when, and that not knowing when was the most frightening thing that had happened to her in 9 years. But the books, my dears, were about to stop balancing. Because something was happening to Verity Finch over that long week, something that was not on any invoice and could not be charged for, and it terrified her more than the Dowager's eyes and Lady Pomfret's snooping and the daily risk of ruin all put together. She was breaking her rule. It was happening so slowly she almost did not notice it, the way you do not notice the tide coming in until your feet are wet. It was in the way the Duke sought her out, not because the performance required it, but because he wanted to, finding her in the library, in the garden, falling into the easy crackling conversation that the two of them, it turned out, could keep up indefinitely, like a game of catch that neither wanted to be the one to drop. It was in the way he started telling her true things, about his parents' terrible, glittering marriage, about why he had armoured himself, about the loneliness under the wit. True things he had never told anyone, because she was the only person he had ever met who was as guarded as he was, and who therefore understood the guarding. And it was in the way she, against every rule she had ever made for herself, started telling him true things back. About Tom, about their father's death, about the long fall and the cold fury and the armour. The library, on the fourth night, was where it happened, and I will let you stand in the doorway for it. The house was asleep. She had come down for a book, unable to sleep herself, and found him there already, a single candle, a glass of brandy, the wit all put away for the night, so that what was left was just a tired, clever, lonely man in the dark. And instead of retreating, she stayed. They talked the way people only talk at 1 in the morning, when the performances of the day are too exhausting to keep up. He told her about his parents, the Great Society marriage, the 40 years of beautiful public loathing, the boy who had grown up at glittering dinners listening to his mother and father destroy each other in flawless drawing-room French so the servants would not understand, and who had decided, at perhaps 10 years as old, that he would never, ever do that to another living soul, and had built a whole armoured, solitary life on the foundation of that one childhood vow. "Everyone thinks I do not marry because I am cold," he said, turning the brandy in the candlelight. "I do not marry because I saw, very young and very close, exactly what a marriage of suitable arrangement does to two people over 40 years, and I would sooner be alone forever than do that to someone. My grandmother thinks she is saving me from loneliness. She does not understand that I chose the loneliness. It was the kinder of the two prisons on offer. And Verity Finch, who had never in 9 years offered a client a single true thing in return for his confidences, heard herself say, into the dark, "I had a vow like that once. When I was 17, my father died and left us nothing but a good name. And I learned in about a fortnight that a good name without money is a coat without buttons in a snowstorm. It looks respectable, and it keeps you no warmer. So I made my vow. I would never again depend on anything I could not earn, owe anything I could not pay, or feel anything I could not afford. And I have kept it for 9 years, and it has kept me alive. And I am telling you this at 1 in the morning in a borrowed library because you are the first person I have ever met who would understand that a vow like that is not the same as a cold heart. It is a very warm heart that has been very thoroughly frightened. There was a silence, the candle guttered, and the Duke of Avondale looked at the woman he was paying by the hour to lie to his family and said, very quietly, "Tell me about Tom." And she did. She told him everything: the brother, the school, the fees, the whole tender mercenary architecture of her life. And he listened the way he had, never listened to anyone. And she talked the way she had never talked to anyone. And somewhere in that hour, the contract between them quietly died. And neither of them said so, because saying so would have meant admitting what had taken its place. She had never told a client the truth about anything in 9 years. She walked back to her room afterward, shaking, because she understood that she had broken the rule, the first rule, the only rule, and that there was no revised estimate in the world that could cover the cost of what she had just done. The Duke was in no better case. He had hired a woman to solve a problem and had instead met, for the first time in his determinedly solitary life, a person he could not stop thinking about, a person who matched him, who saw him, who was not the least bit impressed by his rank, and a great deal impressed, despite herself, by him. He, who had spent his whole adulthood fending off marriage, found himself in the absurd position of being engaged, in the eyes of his entire family, to the one woman he had ever met whom he might actually want to be engaged to, and of knowing that the engagement was a fiction he was paying for by the hour, that she was a professional doing a job, that the warmth in her grey eyes might itself be the finest performance of a brilliant performer, and that he had no way on earth of knowing whether any of it was real. It was, he reflected, the single most ironic situation he had ever heard of, and he was living in it, and he was, to his own horror and against the entire architecture of his life, happy. And then came the breaking point, and it came, as these things do, from the most dangerous quarter, which was honesty. But before honesty did its work, spite made one last lunge, and it nearly brought the whole house of cards down a day early. Lady Pomfret, having failed to trap Verity in private, and having been fed a banquet of nonsense by the treacherous Suki, made her final play in public on the 5th evening before the assembled house. She had spent the week, you see, quietly writing letters of her own, to a sister in town, to a cousin who knew everyone, fishing for any scrap on the mysterious Mrs. Finch's family. And that evening, over the cards, with the whole company in earshot, she struck. "I have been making inquiries about your people, my dear Mrs. Finch," she announced, in a voice of poisonous sweetness that turned every head. "And the most curious thing, no one in town has ever heard of them at all. Not a soul. One would almost think the family did not exist. How do you account for it? It was a killing stroke, delivered in front of 19 witnesses, and it was meant to be. And for one heartbeat, the room held its breath, and the Duke's hand went white around his cards. And Verity Finch set down her own cards and looked at Lady Pomfret with an expression of gentle, devastating pity, and said, 'I account for it very easily, Lady Pomfret. My family was reduced, as I have never hidden, and reduced families are precisely the families that town has never heard of. Because town only troubles to hear of families with money. You have proven only that we were poor, which I have told everyone since the day I arrived. I confess I am touched that you went to the expense of so many letters to confirm a thing I freely volunteered over the soup on my first night. Had you asked me, I should have saved you the postage. The room, which adored nothing so much as a sharp riposte well delivered, rippled with the particular cruel delight of spectators, watching an aggressor impaled on her own spear, and Lady Pomfret, scarlet, was left with nothing, having attacked and been seen to attack, and gained only the appearance of a spiteful woman hounding a poor bereaved girl. It was a total rout. But it cost Verity something the room could not see. It cost her the cold, clear nerve she had relied on for 9 years, because for the first time, in the half-second before she answered, she had felt not the familiar professional calm, but a stab of pure fear. Fear of being exposed, yes, but underneath it. Far worse, fear of being exposed in front of him. She had never, in 9 years, cared what a client thought of the woman behind the performance. She cared now, and caring, she understood as she gathered her cards with steady hands and a hammering heart, was the one thing her armour had never been built to survive. It was the 6th day. The week was nearly done. The performance had nearly run its course. Soon Verity Finch would present her final, magnificent invoice and vanish back to her unfashionable street and her notebook and her brother's school fees, and the Duke of Avondale would be left to explain to his family that the engagement had been, sadly, called off. That was the plan. That had always been the plan. And on 6th evening, the Dowager Duchess, who had been watching all week with the silent satisfaction of a chess player whose pieces are all exactly where she put them, arranged a moment alone with Verity Finch, sent the others off on some pretext, and sat the young woman down, and looked at her with those terrible ancient knowing eyes, and said, "You may stop now, my dear. The performance has been exquisite, quite the finest I have seen, and I have seen a great many. But you and I both know that you are not engaged to my grandson, that you met him a week ago, and that you are, I should guess, being paid rather a remarkable sum to be here." And Verity Finch, caught at last, caught flat, by the one person clever enough to catch her, felt the bottom drop out of 9 years of never being caught. She did not bother to deny it. There was no point. The old woman's eyes held no doubt at all, only certainty. And Verity had not survived 9 years by wasting a lie on someone who already knew the truth. She simply went very still and waited for the blow, the exposure, the ruin, the magistrate, the end of everything, all the disasters she had spent 9 years staying one careful step ahead of, arriving at last in the small terrible person of an 81-year-old woman with a handkerchief and a will of iron. But here is the turn. The great turn, the reasons of the Dowager Duchess, is the secret heart of this whole comedy. Because the old woman did not denounce her, she leaned forward, and her terrible eyes were not cold at all. They were bright and fierce and almost kind, and she said, "Do not look so stricken, child. I have known since the soup. I am not going to expose you. I am going to ask you a question, and I want the truth, since your name is Verity, and it would be a pity to waste it. In the 4 days since you stopped performing for my benefit and started, whether you have admitted it to yourself or not, simply talking to my grandson because you cannot help it, has it become real? And before you answer with another beautiful lie, understand that I am 81 years old. I have buried everyone I ever loved, and I have exactly one wish left in this world, which is to see that lonely clever boy looked at, just once before I die, by someone who actually sees him. I had given up hope of it, and then a professional liar walked into my dining room and made him laugh. And I have spent a week watching the two of you fall into something that neither of you has the courage to name. So, the truth, Verity Finch, has it become real? And Verity Finch, who had not wept in front of another human being since she was 17 years old, who had built her entire self out of never letting anything be real, sat in front of the most frightening woman in England and discovered that she could not this once produce a lie. "Yes," she said, "God help me, yes. And it is the most expensive mistake of my entire life, Your Grace, because a duke cannot marry a woman who hires herself out by the hour, and I cannot afford a broken heart. I have a brother to keep, and on Thursday I am going to take my fee and go back to my real life and never see him again, because that is the only sensible thing to do. And I have survived 9 years by being sensible. So please, let me finish the week and pay me and let me go, and do not be kind to me, because I have armored myself against everything in this world, except kindness, and yours will undo me, and I cannot afford to be undone. There it is, the breaking point, the moment the armor came off. And it did not come off in triumph or defiance, but in a quiet confession to a terrifying old woman in a candlelit room, which is, I think, exactly how the bravest things are usually done. And the Dowager Duchess of Avondale looked at the brave, frightened, brilliant young woman who had told her the truth at last, and she smiled. Not the dangerous smile this time, but something softer and far more dangerous to Verity's plans. And she said only, "We shall see, child, we shall see." And she did not tell Verity what she meant, because she was the Dowager Duchess of Avondale, and she had run this campaign from the inside for a week, and she was not nearly finished. What happened next is the reversal, and it is the part I have been saving, so let me give it to you whole. Verity Finch did the sensible thing. Of course she did. She had been doing the sensible thing for 9 years. On the final morning, she packed her small case, and she sat down at the little writing desk in her borrowed room, and she prepared her final invoice. The great masterpiece, the complete accounting of 1 week's impossible work, every line item rendered in her neat, merciless hand. And at the very bottom, where the total should have gone, she sat for a long time with her pen, and then she did something she had never done in 9 years of business. She wrote, instead of a sum, for the last 4 days, the conversations in the library, the truth told and the truth heard, the being seen, no charge. Some things I find I am not able to invoice for, and I am too good a bookkeeper to pretend otherwise. The balance due is for 6 days' professional services only. The seventh I shall keep for myself, as the single luxury I have permitted myself in 9 years. Goodbye, Your Grace. You were the best client I ever had, and the worst thing that ever happened to me, and I would not undo a moment of it, which is the most unprofessional thing I have ever confessed. V. Finch. She left the invoice on the desk. She did not say goodbye to him in person. She could not have survived it. She had the carriage brought round, and she climbed in with her small case and her armour hastily reassembled, and she set off down the long drive of Avondale Court, back toward her unfashionable street and her notebook and her sensible, solitary, well-defended life. And she had got perhaps half a mile when the carriage stopped, because there was a man standing in the middle of the drive, hatless, his coat wrong for the hour, having clearly run, holding a sheet of paper in his hand. It was the Duke of Avondale, and when Verity Finch climbed down from the carriage, her heart hammering against the armour, he did not say what she expected. He did not plead, or command, or offer her money to stay. He did the one thing in all the world that could possibly have reached her. He held up the sheet of paper, and she saw that it was an invoice, a clumsy, ducal, badly itemized invoice, written in a hand quite unaccustomed to itemizing anything. And he said, a little breathlessly, "You left without letting me settle my account, Mrs. Finch, and I find I cannot allow it. You have always insisted on a complete accounting, so I have prepared one of my own, if you will permit me." And he read it aloud there in the middle of the drive, in the morning light. Item, he read, one bachelor's certainty, 34 years in the building, demolished entirely in the space of 1 week. Item, one heart, the existence of which I had successfully denied my whole life, located, against my will, and now apparently the property of another. Item, the discovery, at the advanced age of 34, that I have never once in my life been truly seen until I was seen by a woman I hired to pretend to know me. Item, the complete and permanent ruin of my ability to be content alone, which had taken me 3 decades to perfect and which you destroyed in 7 days. Item, hazard pay, for I have never in my life been in such danger as I have been this week, and from such a small and terrifying source. And then he looked up from the paper, and his voice was not steady at all, and he said, "I have totaled the account, Mrs. Finch, and the sum is rather large, and I find there is only one form of payment I will accept. The balance due is the rest of your life. I am asking you to marry me. Not as a performance, and not for a fee, and not for one dinner. For real. The one thing you said could never happen. I am asking you to make the lie true." For a long moment, Verity Finch could not speak at all, which had not happened to her since she was 17 years old. Every instinct, 9 years in the building, screamed at her to do what she always did, to find the witty deflection, to name a price, to turn the terrifying real thing into a manageable transaction and walk away with her armor intact. She could feel the safe, cold, sensible answer rising in her, the answer that had kept her alive. Thank him, refuse him, take her fee, protect herself, protect Tom. Never again stand on a cold step, depending on anything she could not earn. And she looked at this man, standing hatless in the drive, with his heart on a badly written invoice. This clever, lonely, guarded man who had run after her carriage, who had taken the one weapon she had, the invoice, the transaction, the price, and turned it inside out into the most defenseless declaration she had ever heard, and she understood that he had done the one thing that could reach her. He had not offered to buy her, or to keep her, or to rescue her. He had offered to be as undefended as she was. He had taken off his armour first, in the road, in the morning light, in front of his mother's approaching carriage, and stood there with nothing, and asked her to do the same. And the wonderful thing was that she wanted to. After 9 years of wanting nothing she could not afford, she wanted this so badly that the wanting frightened her more than any near discovery ever had. There is the reversal, my dears, and I hope you feel how complete it is. He had begun by hiring her, by holding all the power, the Duke and his money and his rank, she the help to be paid and dismissed. And he ended standing hatless in a drive, having run after a departing carriage, holding his own heart out on a badly written invoice, asking a professional liar to take the most enormous risk of her life, while she, the woman who had always set the price, who had always been the one in control of every transaction, stood there for once, in her life utterly at a loss. The tables turned so thoroughly that the powerful man was the one trembling, and the hired woman was the one who held in her answer the whole of his future. The power had passed entirely into her hands, and the wonderful, the perfect thing is what she did with it. She did not fall into his arms, not yet. She was Verity Finch. She was sensible to the last. She looked at him, and at the absurd invoice, and she said, with the ghost of her old dry composure, but with her eyes very bright, "You have made several errors in your accounting, Your Grace. Your itemization is a disgrace, and your hand is illegible. But the principal error is this. You have failed to account for the fact that society will never accept a duchess who once played a Russian countess for hire, and that your grandmother." And at that exact moment, because the Dowager Duchess of Avondale had been 3 moves ahead the entire time and was not about to miss her own checkmate, a second carriage came rolling up the drive, and the window came down, and the terrifying old face appeared, and the Dowager Duchess said, in a voice that brooked no argument from heaven or earth, "Your grandmother, Mrs. Finch, has spent 60 years making society believe whatever she tells it to believe. and society will accept precisely whomever I say it will accept. And I have decided to say it will accept you. I have, this morning, informed 11 of the greatest gossips in England that my grandson's engagement is the love match of the decade, and that the dear girl's family, though tragically reduced, is older than half the peerage. By tomorrow it will be true, because I have said it, and I have not been contradicted on a matter of fact in 40 years. Now do stop keeping the poor boy standing in the road, and say yes, so that I may go home and begin planning the wedding, which I have, naturally, already begun planning. And Verity Finch, the orphan, the actress, the professional liar named for the truth, the woman who had armoured herself for 9 years against everything except kindness, stood in the drive at Avondale Court, with a duke offering her his whole heart on a badly itemized invoice, and a dowager duchess offering her the protection of the most formidable name in England, and she felt the armour she had worn since she was 17 years old simply fall away, all at once, with a sensation less like breaking than like setting down a weight she had carried so long she had forgotten it was not part of her own body. And she did the bravest and most unprofessional thing she had ever done in her life. She said yes, and then, because she was still and always Verity Finch, she added, "But I am keeping my notebook. A woman should always be able to keep her own accounts." And the Duke of Avondale laughed, the real laugh, the one his grandmother had crossed a county to hear again, and he took her hand, not to settle an account, but to keep it. And the Dowager Duchess, in her carriage, allowed herself the small, satisfied smile of a general who has won a war that no one else even knew she was fighting. They were married that summer at Avondale Court, and the wedding was, by the Dowager's design, so enormous and so unimpeachably grand that not one whisper of the truth could survive it. Society, told firmly by its most fearsome authority that this was the great romance of the age, believed it utterly, the way society always believes whatever it is told confidently enough by someone it is afraid of. It was, by every account, the wedding of the season, and the Dowager Duchess sat in the front pew through the whole of it, with the serene, terrifying, satisfied expression of a general reviewing a battlefield on which every single thing has gone precisely according to a plan that no one else even knew existed. She had won. She had crossed a county and overturned her own scheme and bent the whole of society to her will, all to put that particular look, the look she had been waiting 20 years to see again, back on her grandson's face. And there it was, at the altar, unmistakable, and she allowed herself, just once, to dab at her eye with a handkerchief, and then glare ferociously at anyone who might have noticed. Lady Pomfret was not invited, which everyone agreed was a great shame and no one meant. And in the second pew, scrubbed and astonished, in a new coat that fit him properly for the first time in his life, sat a 12-year-old boy who had arrived expecting to visit his widowed sister, Mrs. Finch, and had instead been informed that she was neither widowed nor Finch, nor, apparently, finished surprising him, and was now to be a duchess, and that he was to come and live in a house with more rooms than his entire school. Verity caught his eye over the heads of the congregation as she came down the aisle, and Tom Finch grinned at his impossible sister, the way he had grinned at her when he was 5, and she had told him, on a cold step, that everything was going to be all right. And Verity, who had spent 9 years making that promise come true at the cost of every soft thing in herself, very nearly broke her composure for the first time in her professional life. Right there, in front of 500 guests, she held it. But it was close. Lady Pomfret took her daughter Eustacia home in a fury that is, I am given to understand, ongoing to this day. And young Tom Finch, 12 years old, clever and entirely bewildered, to discover that his widowed sister was neither widowed nor named Finch and was now a duchess, Tom Finch was brought from his good school to a very much better one, and given a future so secure that his sister, who had sold 9 years of her life to buy him a corner of safety, could finally stop counting the cost of every single thing. And here is the part I love best, the part that tells you it was real. Verity did keep her notebook. She kept her accounts all her life, with the same meticulous ferocity, because some habits are earned too hard to give up, and because, as she said, a duchess who cannot read a ledger is at the mercy of every steward in the county. But there was a page at the back of that notebook that she never showed anyone but her husband, and on it, over the years, she kept a different kind of account. Not of money, but of the things she had received that she had never been able to invoice for and never wanted. 2. The conversations in the library, the laugh in the drive, a small hand growing into a tall man's, a terrifying old woman's blessing, the strange, unlooked-for safety of being, after a lifetime of performances, finally and entirely herself, with someone who had seen through her best disguise and loved what he found underneath. She titled that page, in her neat, merciless hand, Receipts. Things received for which no payment was possible, and none, it turns out, was ever required. And she added to it all her life. The first entry, written in a hand that shook just slightly, was a duke's badly itemized invoice. Kept folded between the pages, the worst piece of accounting she had ever seen, and the only one she would not have changed by a single word. The second was her brother's voice, the day he understood he was safe forever. The third was an old woman's hand closes over hers at a wedding, and the old woman saying low, so no one else could hear, "I knew at the soup, child. I always know. Welcome to the family you were never supposed to have." And there were more, year on year, in a hand that grew steadier as the woman grew happier. A ledger kept all her life, not of what she was owed, but of what she had been given, by a world she had spent her youth being certain, owed her nothing, and would give her less. She had been wrong about that, in the end. It was the most expensive error of her career, and the only one she ever thanked God for. I have told you a great many stories, and the funny ones are rarer than you might think, because true comedy is the hardest thing of all. It has to make you laugh, and then, when you are off your guard, slip the real thing in under your ribs. But I have come to believe that the comedies are the truest stories of all, because they understand the thing the tragedies forget, which is that the armor we build to survive is not the same as the life we are surviving for, and that the bravest thing a guarded person can ever do is not to fight, but to set the armor down. Verity Finch spent 9 years convinced that the only safety was to feel nothing, owe nothing, need no one, and charge for everything. And she was right. It kept her alive, and it was killing her, both at once, the way good armor always does. And then a desperate duke and a scheming dragon conspired between them to trick her into the one thing she had sworn never to do, which was to let it be real. The greatest performance of life turned out to be the one where she finally stopped performing. And the woman who could put a price on anything discovered, at the last, the one thing she would not sell, and gave it away for free, which is the only way that particular thing has ever been purchased by anyone in any story I know. Some things, as she wrote, cannot be invoiced for. The whole art of a life, it seems to me, is in learning which ones, and in being brave enough when you finally find them to hand them over without a fee. We spend so much of our lives, all of us, keeping careful accounts of who owes us, of what we are owed, of every slight and every debt, and we are right to, the world being what it is. But there comes, if we are very lucky, one account in a lifetime that we are meant to stop keeping, one ledger we are meant to close and push away, and leave forever unbalanced in another person's favour, and call it not a loss, but the only profit that ever mattered. Verity Finch found hers in a drive at Avondale Court on a sheet of badly itemized paper, held out by a man brave enough to be the first to set down his armour. And she did the bravest, most unprofessional, most profitable thing of her entire career. She tore up the bill. So we have come to the end, you and I find, as I always do, that I am sorry to let you go, and sorrier than usual, because we laughed together tonight. And laughing together is a particular kind of intimacy I do not like to give up. You stayed with me through a soup and a dragon and a week of escalating, glorious catastrophe, and you trusted me to bring the two stubborn fools together in the end, and I hope I did it to your satisfaction. Before you go back to wherever in the world you are sitting, and you really must tell me down in the comments, because I do love to know who has been laughing with me in the dark. Let me ask you the thing I always ask. If Verity's story put a smile on your face, and then, when you were not looking, something warmer in your chest, then do the small kind thing and subscribe to Jane Tells Stories so that the next time I light the fire, you will be here. And if you have come all this way with me and you still will not subscribe, well, then I am afraid you owe me a favor. And you know by now that I always collect. Tell me where you are watching from. Tell me what the last line of your own invoice would say, the things you have received that no money could ever cover. And come back soon, because I have another story already warming by the fire, and it is a good one. Good night, my dears. Keep your accounts honest. And when you find the one thing you cannot put a price on, be brave and give it away.